Okay, great. I think we have most of the attendees here. There's a few that are still coming in, but it's okay. We can get started just so that I know it's a Friday morning. Everyone has work to get back to, and those who are off want to go off and enjoy the rest of their day. So we will get started. Welcome everybody to our introduction to the Climate Ambassadors Program hosted here at Expo City. This is an initiative by the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment for students in our countdown to COP28. So COP28 will be hosted here at Expo City end of November until December. And this program has been set up in collaboration with us here at the Expo School program to introduce students to COP28. What is COP? What's the purpose of these conferences that they have? What's the purpose of these negotiations? I think it's an introduction to a lot of teachers as well. We have a lot more teachers asking us questions about the importance of these conferences. We have here my colleague Georgie, Georgina, as you guys can all see, we call her Georgie, who is going to take us through this virtual session of all the details of what to expect. She will take us through what is COP, why is COP important, and she'll also take us through what is CAP, which is our initiative here with the Ministry of Climate Change, introducing students to negotiations and how these negotiations happen and the importance of them. If you do have any questions at any time, please feel free to write them in the chat box. We will answer all the questions at the very end. Hopefully we do cover all of the areas that you have, but do feel free anytime you have a question. I will keep them till the end because there's a lot of content we're going to go through. It should only take about 30 minutes to get through the content, and then we'll leave it open for all of the questions and answers at the very end. Okay, so I'll hand it over to you, Georgie, and take us through COP.
Thank you, Huda. Can everybody see and hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. You always have the loveliest introduction, so thank you very much. But good morning, everybody. Welcome to CAP. Welcome, teachers. Welcome, students, now climate action ambassadors, and welcome to our virtual information session. My name is Georgina, or Georgie, and I'm one of the CAP facilitators here at Expo City, Dubai. When you do come in, there's a whole team of us here waiting to meet all of you, so you should definitely meet some of us in person for your actual immersive experience. But right now, for the purpose of this virtual session, we'll go through some of the basics of CAP experience, and then we will open the floor for discussion and questions. So if you do happen to think of a question midway, teachers and students, like Huda said, please make a note of it. You can leave it in the chat. Huda is moderating the session, so she's keeping an eye on the chat, or you can leave it in your notebook on your own, but we will address them together at the end. Yeah, but before we get right into CAP, we'll explore a little backstory so that we can get you excited about COP and really understand why it impacts CAP. So what exactly is COP, right? So COP stands for the Conference of Parties. It's a meeting that happens every year, and the parties that are at this meeting, much like you would be when you attend this session, Climate Action Ambassadors, the parties are simply the countries that come together, right? COP28 this year will mean that it's the 28th meeting of these parties. So they've been meeting for a very, very long time. And this year, like most of you may know, they're meeting for the 28th time in Dubai, UAE. Now, the conference is an annual meeting, which means it happens every single year. But what this means for COP and the parties is that the whole block or the whole body of parties make really, really important decisions. So when they come together at this annual conference, this is their main priority. They make decisions. And what do they make decisions about? Well, they talk about climate change and how we can further pursue climate action, right? And they do this by implementing a little treaty. So we'll look at that in the very next slide. It's called the UNFCCC. A lot of letters, but we can break it down really, really easily. So that stands for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, the purpose or the main goal of this COP body is to implement this treaty called the UNFCCC. A convention is essentially a treaty, right? So it's an agreement or a sign of agreement by all of these different parties who come together saying that they will all achieve the same goal. And in this case, that particular goal is to combat climate change, right? So to sum that up, COP, it's a body of all the different countries or parties. They come together and they implement this particular treaty called the UNFCCC. and they try and pursue climate action. But what is the treaty based on? Right? So before we get into the aims of the UNFCCC, there's one really cool climate-related concept that this treaty addresses massively. Most of you may recognize this slide because we've been learning about this in school for a while now. But that's right, we're talking about the greenhouse gases and the greenhouse effects. Right? You'll see that really dark blue barrier that goes all the way above, right above in the atmosphere, which essentially covers the Earth like a little blanket, right? If you've ever stepped into a greenhouse, glass house where you grow plants inside, really good for tomatoes, or if you've ever stepped into your car after you've parked it out on a really hot day in an outdoor parking space, the minute you open the door, there's a gust of warm air that comes to get you, right? And that's because of the glass on the outside, which acts as a barrier. And these greenhouse gases on the outside of the Earth form the exact same barrier. So what do? They allow the sunlight to pass through the atmosphere, pass through this barrier, but they prevent it from leaving the atmosphere, right? So the greenhouse gases are on top, they prevent it from leaving the atmosphere, and that means all the heat is then trapped within this barrier and affects the Earth. This keeps the planet warm, which, if you think about it, is actually a really good thing, right? Because if we did not have this barrier to keep all of the sun's rays in and keep the planet warm, our planet would actually be, on average, almost 33 degrees colder, right? Think about it. The Ice Age would almost be like an everyday thing, right? We would probably be living on blocks of ice and trying to figure out how to work around that, but we would not have the sun or the warmth that we feel today. So it is a really, really good thing. But too much of the good thing, too much of these greenhouse gases is what makes it really bad, right? Human activities now, like the cars that you see in the slide or the little truck driving by, as it burns fuel, it's releasing more of these greenhouse gases into the air. Right? Some of the greenhouse gases that we know and we're familiar with, like carbon dioxide, but some that we don't usually think about, like methane, are a lot more volatile, right? And they come from land use change and changing big forests into agricultural fields so that our cattle and our cows can grow there, right? So all of these greenhouse gases, because of our human activities, are now being added into the atmosphere. And what does that mean? It's warming up the Earth far too quickly, right? And the effect of that we see now on a daily basis is the increase in the frequency of all of this human-induced natural disasters. All right, so why are the greenhouse gases important? Is what the UNFCCC addresses. So when we bring that back to that international treaty, we see that the UNFCCC then has two really, really important aims to combat climate change. The first one is to prevent our human interference with the climate system. This basically means to stop us as human beings from performing too many of these activities that contribute to this barrier of greenhouse gases. And the other aim is to stabilize the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. So the greenhouse gases that are already in there, fine. The first one is that we stop adding more to it, we try and reduce. But two, for the greenhouse gases that are already in there, we make sure that the current level remains stable. Right? So when these parties at COP, when they meet every year, this is what they talk about. They discuss the clauses of the UNFCCC and they see how we can achieve these two aims. Right? And like I mentioned, COP, they've been discussing the UNFCCC for a really, really long time. If you look at the very top of this little thermometer, you'll see the very first COP happened in 1995, right, in Berlin. And that's when they started talking about the UNFCCC. And then there were lots of changes that were made in the middle. We had the Kyoto Protocol come in right there in 97. You'll see in 2015 when they met at Paris, they had a really cool Paris Agreement that came in, which in COP21, which if you have time, you should read about because it has some really cool facts about how we keep the Earth's global average temperature in control. And now for the 28th time this year, they will meet in Dubai, UAE. Which brings us to CAP, which is our program that we have created, like Huda mentioned earlier, and how we are trying to simulate this COP experience for you, our climate action ambassadors, right? So what is CAP? It stands for Climate Ambassadors Program. It's an initiative by the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment. And really, we are trying to simulate a COP negotiation experience through immersive role play. So what would be your role as a student? You essentially become a climate action ambassador for a country, right? So as the climate action ambassador, you will then learn about the climate-related issues in your country. You will talk to your fellow ambassadors within your country blocks, which I will talk about a little bit later, and you will come together to create solutions for your fellow ambassadors. Teachers, if you're still listening, your role is just as massive as the students are, right? Because you get to observe the proceedings that we have during the CAP experience and discuss these outcomes at schools. Because we always believe that the first step to climate action is having an honest climate conversation and climate education, right? So the more we incorporate all of these aspects of climate action in our curriculum, the easier it becomes to be able to talk and disseminate this information to our friends and families as well. And then we have us. So our role, so you'll meet our team of facilitators when you come in as well, but our role will be to facilitate your CAP program as the chair, the vice chair, but we will also be on the floor with you as model ambassadors. So when you are assigned countries to discuss for CAP, you'll see that you are not assigned the country UAE or China. So we will have our model ambassadors trained on being the UAE and the Chinese climate action ambassador, and they will help you come up with solutions as well during the session. So this is a high-level overview of what the session looks like. But what essentially are we doing and what are we talking about is what we will figure out in this slide. So at CAP, as these climate action country ambassadors, we will learn about climate-related issues. But these issues, and we would have seen this from our own particular country, are not twofold or two-dimensional. There are multiple issues and multiple variables that affects the country. So to make sure we have a conversation that is focused on one topic, every single CAP session will have a key topic of focus. And this topic is referred to as an agenda. Right, so through the CAP experience, we have created multiple different agendas. We've got 5 different agendas, as you can see on the screen. We've got carbon and GHG mitigation, we've got clean energy transition, loss and damage, and then food security, and we also talk about environmental health. But each CAP session will only be focused on one particular agenda. So if you've registered for a CAP session and you're attending next week, you will most likely know which agenda you are a part of. So once we know the agenda, what we really need to then figure out is what the issues within that agenda are. So we do that by actually talking to each other and figuring out how our fellow ambassadors can contribute. Parties at COP actually form opinions in groups that look a lot like this, and they're referred to as negotiation blocks. If you've ever been to an MUN, so a Model United Nations Conference, you have most likely represented yourself as an individual country ambassador, right? Here, you actually make opinions with like-minded countries and with countries that have come together under the UNFCCC because they have the same policies and want the same kind of solutions. There are multiple negotiation blocks that are recognized by the UN, but for the purpose of our experience at CAP, we will have 4 blocks that participate in discussion. As you see on the screen right now, our first block right there, we've got the G77 in China, we've got the Arab states, we've got the European Union, and the Alliance of Small Island States. So if you've already been assigned a country, it should be on this particular list, and whichever column you spot your assigned country in, that's the negotiation block that you are a part of, right? So this means you will work with the other country ambassadors in this column to 1, figure out your climate-related issues together, but 2, to also find solutions for the same, right? So it's a lot of collective, collaborative effort as opposed to individual work, okay? Which brings us to what our main purpose or what our main aim for the CAP experience is, right? So we're coming together, we're finding all these problems, but really the crux of the experience is to figure out how we can find solutions to tackle climate change and how we can get innovative ways, right? Feedback and innovative ways to actually pursue climate action globally. So when thinking of solutions for the Earth, we'll focus largely on 2 different types of measures. As you can see at the very top of the screen, we've got the words mitigation and adaptation. Okay, so let's quickly break down what these 2 terms mean. So let's look at mitigation first. Now, mitigation is the ability to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So if you go back and think about that one slide where we saw the greenhouse gases and the greenhouse effect, that dark blue ribbon around the Earth, the dark blue band, right? The barrier around the Earth is where all of our greenhouse gases are located. Now, what we are trying to do is not have more activities where we add to those greenhouse gases, but what we need to also do is figure out how we can reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we send up there, right? So what are the things that we can do to make sure we don't add to the gases? And what are the things that we can do to reduce the amount that we already have in the air? How can we pull them back? How can we store them? How can we sequester them? That's a good word for you to look at when you leave, right? And how can we reduce these emissions? That's what we refer to as mitigation. On the other hand, we've got adaptation, right? Now, adaptation is the ability to actually adapt to the effects of climate change, right? We know that all of these greenhouse gas emissions are making the Earth hotter. They're making the Earth warmer. As a result of this global warming, what do we have? We have frequent natural disasters, right? The occurrence of these disasters is at a much higher level than it was before. So we understand that it is already happening, but how can we better adapt to it, right? How can we better fix all of these effects of climate change that we are facing? So in short, if you think about it, when you think about mitigation, it's how do we fix the actual causes of climate change, right? The greenhouse gas emissions, how do we fix the causes? But if you talk about adaptation, it's how do we fix the effects of climate change, right? On the screen right here in the little infograph, you'll see some of the examples that we usually use for mitigation, sustainable transportation, right? Or using public transportation. That's a lower carbon footprint. There's less carbon being released into the air because there's less fuel that's being burned. So we're adding less GHGs into the atmosphere. But adaptation, right? Flood resilience. If you're a small island state, one of your biggest concerns is the fact that the sea level is rising so quickly. So how do you adapt to that? How do you build bigger flood walls? How do you build better sea barriers? How do you stop your fresh water from getting mixed in with your salt water through saltwater intrusion? So these are the adaptation measures that you'll need to think of. So when you come for your session at CAP, this is essentially what we are doing. We're going to explore different adaptation strategies for our action plans, and we will see how they lead to mitigation within the agenda. Right? So it's a lot of information, but how can you really come prepped, or how can you prepare for this? Well, the best place to start really is to think about what your country or your allocated country is doing, right? So if you're allotted Trinidad and Tobago, it's figuring out how your country can advocate for climate action, right? So if you can figure out how you can research your assigned country, that means you've already taken the first step, right? You will still have time to read up on this when you come with us, but it's a wonderful place to start. The other place to start is our pre-visit resource pack. Right, so when you had registered for the experience, you would have received a list of countries along with the agenda for the particular day. And along with that, a little document called the Pre-Visit Resource Pack. Now, it's chock full of information about the CAP structure, the agendas, the history of COP, which really talks about the different treaties that we spoke about earlier, like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, and why they're so important. But it also has a little CAP glossary at the very end that has very important keywords. Some of the words that I spoke about earlier and I told you to think about later, like carbon sequestration, carbon storage, saltwater intrusion. You'll find all of these words in there, but they will really help build that climate knowledge foundation. Okay? If you're all done with the pre-visit resource pack, another place to look at is the agenda at hand. So if your agenda, for example, is food security and climate change, aside from country policies, maybe something you could check is what countries around the world are doing to make sure that the food in their country is secure, right? To make sure to try and figure out adaptation strategies from around the world and see how maybe you, as your country, could incorporate the same. And the very last place to leave that would be with country policies. So now that you understand what the agenda is, you understand what COP and CAP are, where does your country stand with these policies, right? So look for ways your country has contributed towards this agenda because that would really, really help in debate and discussion. And that's a lot of research, and that's a lot of prep work. And all of this prep work would really, really help you have a super impactful session. But the only thing you really need to have a fantastic session is your willingness to actually come in with an open mind, have an honest climate conversation, feel passionately, right, for climate action, and explore climate change with us. So even if you're coming in with no prior research and no prep work, your role as a climate action ambassador is so important, right? Because you remember at the very beginning, I said our first step to climate action is climate conversation, right? And that's exactly what you're coming in to do. So bring your best self, bring plenty of imagination, because like I said, we're going to come up with really innovative solutions together, right? But come with the willingness to talk openly and honestly about climate change. And as for actual research, if you're actually coming in with no research, don't worry about that too much too, because during the course of your session, to make it easier to actually come up with these solutions with everybody else and to find facts and factual knowledge that can support your content, you're also allowed to bring in your laptop or your iPad to research in the middle of the session. Yeah, but that's, in a nutshell, that's essentially what we're doing at CAP. So your role as a climate action ambassador is super important, but we can only make sure that it's worth it if you understand your role and your purpose. So leading with that, I'll open the floor for any questions that you may have. If they're operational, I will most likely call on to Huda to help me out because I don't know, but Huda does all of the important stuff. But if it's content-based, I'm right here. So any questions?
Thank you for that, Georgie. I've put a message in the chat box, so if anybody does have any questions, we'll be happy to answer that. Will it be okay if we tie the other agendas in with ours? Question is from Adina.
Very nice question. All right, so one of the things we look at is try to keep the focus or the conversation, the climate conversation, very focused on the agenda, but there are a lot of agendas that may overlap in the session. So when we do have the debate and discussion, you're welcome to bring up points that may talk about the other agendas, but we will keep the conversation in general. So when it comes to finding problems and finding solutions, we will keep the conversation focused on that particular agenda for the session. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, got it, she says. I don't know if you can see the chat box, Georgie, but I'll read it for you.
But thank you.
Our students would like to know if they will receive a certificate of participation from Catherine. Yes, all students will receive a certificate of participation on the day of. So of course, it's very important that they're participating in this in CAP, and they will all receive one. We have a thank you, Georgie. That was awesome, from Nasreen as well.
Thank you, Nasreen.
Thank you, Nasreen. Any other questions? Anybody have any questions, concerns, comments? Will there be nominations for things like best delegate, like the MUN style events? Good question, Catherine. Very good question. Georgie?
Good question, Catherine. So the CAP experience has been designed super intuitively. So I'll tell you a little bit of a thought process behind the actual experience. When I was in school, I would actually do a lot of MUNs. I chaired a couple before I was leaving. And one of the things that I would always see is I would always get picked for all of the MUNs because I had experience and I could do it, right? But all of my friends, the ones that would actually love to have the conversation with me, would never actually get picked for the same events or get the same experience. But that's the one thing we talk about at CAP. It's the fact that the climate conversation needs to happen with everybody, right? So everybody needs to understand climate change. Everybody needs to understand how to pursue climate action because everybody has a massive role to play in keeping the earth alive and keeping it safe for us. So it's not competition based at all. There is no competition of sorts, actually. It's not an individual approach either. So in negotiation blocks, it will be collaborative and collective effort. So there will be no best delegate. There will be no best negotiation block, but we will make sure that everybody's voices are heard. And we will make sure that we appreciate and recognize that as well during the session.
Thank you. That question was actually from Virali, one of the students. So very good question, Virali. Sidra would like to know what should be in our opening statement.
Oh, good question. Your opening statement is the very first time you address the floor as your climate action ambassador is actually with your fellow ambassadors. So when you do figure out what your opening statements are and you're addressing the floor, you will actually come up with this little statement with everybody else, right? So you'll have a little pool, you'll have a little breakout session. So that's part of the CAP structure as well. You'll have breakout sessions where you have time with just your individual block, and you will come up with these statements to present together. So again, collaborative, collective effort. So not something you need to worry about for now either.
Great, thank you, Georgie. Someone has asked, sorry, Catherine again, a couple students couldn't make it to the training. Will the recording be shared? Yes, we are recording this session. We will check the content and make sure that it's very clear and the audio is clear, and then we will share it with everybody who has attended today. So it'll be sent to the same people that received the meeting link to begin with, and then you can share it with whoever you feel is necessary, whether it's the students or any of the teachers who might be joining them as well. Manahal has a question. If we could bring up wars between the countries, which could affect the solutions for the climate change. Very good question, Manahal.
Very good question as well. As much as we can, we will try and not talk about geopolitics unless it affects climate financing and funding. Part of the discussion at one point will be to talk about climate financing and funding for all the solutions that we look at. But on a more high level overview, we will be looking at individual adaptation strategies that the countries and the blocs can come up with, as opposed to actual geopolitical tensions, right? So think less MUN, think more adaptation and climate action through adaptation.
Thank you for that, Georgie. I hope, Manaha, that answers your question. Dua would like to know, there are some countries that aren't involved, but do have a big role to play in the world stage, especially for the environment. How do we bring forward those countries? I'm loving these questions, I have to say.
Yeah, I love this. I'm so glad we're recording this session. Great questions. So 198 countries around the world. We had to choose 40 for this experience. I'll be honest, it was really hard to not have all of the countries on the floor, right? But what makes it slightly easier for us is, like I'd mentioned earlier, at COP, countries negotiate in party blocks or in party groupings, right? So what we have done instead of looking at individual countries is find out how our agendas really affect these negotiation blocks as a whole, right? So you'll see that if you are, let's say, part of the Alliance of Small Island States, for example, there are some concepts within the agenda which will affect you, but not just you as an individual country, you as a bloc largely than it does the others, right? If you are a part of the European Union, you have a really big task to think about things like technology transfer, to think about things like climate financing. So as opposed to thinking of individual countries, we thought of how the blocs could actually contribute to the conversation and the discussion, right? So the countries that we've chosen within the blocs do all have a say, and that's probably why some of the most important countries are not in here, because they're part of different blocs. But again, think about it from bloc perspective as opposed to an individual country perspective.
Thank you very much, Georgie. I hope that answers your question. She says, thank you so much, Georgie. And Manahal also says, thank you a lot. Husna would like to know if possible, if our ideas will possibly be implemented or at least talked about at COP28 later on.
Ooh, Husna, that's a great question. I don't really have an answer for you, but what I'll tell you is that if it does happen, that would be really, really cool, right? What we are doing is making sure that we're keeping track of your action plans, all the solutions that you do come up with. We're keeping it with ourselves and we're making sure we're making note of it. There's a little floor session report that that your teachers also get at the end of the experience. And we do talk about all of these solutions and all of the innovative clauses that you have come up with. If that does happen in the future, that would be really, really cool. But I just don't really have an answer for you at this point. But here's hoping that it does get there. Sorry, if I could also quickly say, at COP, the state parties are the government leaders, the ministry leaders, the state ambassadors who come in and have the conversations about the UNFCCC. So we have the state parties on one end, but we also have non-state parties. Non-state parties includes civil society, indigenous people, academia, business persons, and like us, the youth, right? So their voices are actually massive massive at every single COP that's being held, right? So we will, in due time, see how the youth are contributing to this COP. And maybe that's a place where you and I can contribute with your solutions and we find a way to push it up. But yeah.
So, Georgie, let me add to that because this will answer Judy's question as well, which is the Ministry of Climate aware of our action plans? So everything that's actually happening in these sessions, your action plans, the floor report that's going to be shared with your school that everyone's creating, all of that is obviously shared with the Ministry of Climate Change. This is their initiative. We are just we are here to facilitate and to provide the session. But the initiative and all of these reports and all of this content is going back to the Ministry of Climate Change with the aim to hopefully have a voice for the youth at COP. What does that look like? How does it look like? We don't know yet. If we have any clarity and we receive anything, of course, we will let you know. But we do know that at least it's going up to the government level. This isn't just within our room and that's it. You know, you have a good day and you leave. No, this is going up to the government levels. I have another. Husna says, thank you for clearing that up. Judy, I hope that answers your question as well. Tasneem is asking, when we're working on an action plan, can we work or take help from countries that aren't in our negotiation blocks?
Very good question. Very good question. All right. So that's something we thought of as well when we were designing the experience. So you would have seen earlier how there are 4 negotiation blocks at the very beginning. So when you do have your first breakout session and you're identifying your problems, you are actually only talking to the country ambassadors within your particular block. But when it comes time to draft your action plan, you're actually still within your block, but your block alone does not draft an action plan. You actually work with the other negotiation block and you try and see what resources you can exchange and how you can help each other and get information from each other. So that's a very, very good question. But yes, you will be working with other negotiation blocks for the action plan.
Okay, thank you, Georgie. Do we have any more questions? Anybody that I missed? I don't see anything here that I might have missed. How much time will we have to talk about our country? Adina is asking.
Good question. So there are multiple times when you actually get to present either up at the podium or have a discussion by raising your placard and initiating debate. They're all different time slots, but on average, when you're presenting, you've got between 3 to 5 minutes to actually go forth and make your statements. During the discussion and the debate, they are not individual speaker time, but they are session time, right? So anywhere between 20 to 30 minutes of actual debate and discussion if you're up for it. So that'll depend on how many questions you have for us.
Thank you, Georgie. Understood. Thank you, says Adina. One thing to add, one of the you will be receiving this in an email later, but there are a few house rules for the CAP session. This is an introductory session in the sense that, you know, it is open for everybody. So whether you have MUN type of experience or you've never done it before, everyone will have a very thorough type of experience. However, some set rules are that you should only speak when your placard goes up. You know, it's not just an open conversation and that we're all talking over each other. This does have a structure to it. It does have a specific plan involved in it. There is a bit of formality as well. Students are expected to come either formally dressed or semi-formal. If you're more comfortable without a tie, that's okay. But just formal, semi-formal, or in your school uniform, but not your PE kits, obviously. But a lot of school uniforms are formal in themselves. So this does have a formality to it. So just so that you understand kind of how the structure of the session itself will go. Fatma is asking, what is the structure of the action plan? I will add to that, Georgie. I'm not sure if it's mentioned in the resource pack, so maybe we can refer it back to the resource pack.
Correct. Yes. So it is in the resource pack. In your resource pack, you'll see the structure of the whole CAP experience in more detail. And chapter 5 of the resource pack talks about action plans. So what do you think of when you're drafting an action plan? Plus a little sample action plan that you can go through. The agenda for that sample action plan is not one that you will be discussing at your CAP experience, but the format and the template of the action plan will be the same. So chapter 5, resource pack, you'll see a little bit of that.
Thank you, Georgie, and thank you for memorizing which chapter it's in. Any more questions? I have to say today's questions are really good. I'm really excited for next week's sessions with you guys.
Absolutely.
Thank you. This session was very clear and helpful, Catherine says. Thank you, Catherine. If any questions do come up, so I know a lot of you may still be going through the resource pack or haven't looked at it yet or looked through the agenda, feel free to send us an email. Your teachers all have the email address that we've been communicating with them. Any question that comes up, we don't always answer emails on the weekend, but you will have an answer by Monday, hopefully, and that will help you plan further. So if anyone does have any issues or anything come up as they're going through it, feel free to drop us an email. That's what we're here for. I do have another question from Minna. Should we also consider the reasons behind countries' inaction, especially when the solutions are so obvious?
Should we also consider
Should
do
we
you
also,
mean
the reasons behind countries' inaction?
reasons behind, so context for countries, histories, that would actually really help with debate. So if you are coming in already prepped and researched and you understand what your country requires, but also understand what your country can provide, that would definitely help with debate and discussion. Unless it's entirely politically aligned, which we may not entertain, but as long as it's still in line with climate action and party resources that you can share to actually further climate action, that might be a really good thing to research on. So sure, yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm not sure if everyone could see everybody else's chat, but Nasreen says that all my girls are wide awake and thank you, Expo, for answering. So I'm not sure if the girls can see Nasreen's message. Any other questions? We're happy to answer. That's the purpose of this session, is that we can make sure that if there's any questions, any concerns, students who want to prep more might have a concern about how they're going to attend this. That's what we are here for. That Manahal says the session was pretty awesome and very informative. Thank you so much for clearing our questions. And Dina says, thank you, Georgie.
Oh,
And
I love that. You're welcome.
thank you, George.
So excited to see you all.
All right. Well, if there's no more questions, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Jody, as well. It's just that all the thank yous are coming in now, so I'm not going to read them all one by one, but thank you so much, everybody. As I mentioned, if you have questions before your session, feel free to drop us an email. And don't worry about it. Either way, we go through some of the basics before you start your session, and then you're going to also, take it all step by step. And, you're obviously all really well and excited preparing for this. So we're excited to have you all next week. All right, have a great weekend. And for those of you who are off today, enjoy the rest of your day. Actually, if you're not off today, enjoy the rest of your day as well. Thank you.